Pacifica Radio's Letters on Politics. On today's show, we'll talk about the legislative reforms that occurred after President Richard Nixon resigned from the White House and how that history may relate to this upcoming general election in November and the possibilities of the future. Our guest is historian Rick Perlstein. He has written extensively about Richard Nixon. He's the author of the book Nixonland, The Rise of a President and the Fracturing of America. Then in the second half of the program, we'll go to Iowa to talk about the latest of what's happening in the Iowa caucus. We'll speak to political scientist David Redlawsk. That's next on Letters on Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Eileen Alfandary. The Iowa Democratic Party says it plans to release at least 50% of results from Monday's caucuses this afternoon at 5 Eastern Time. Party Chair Troy Price didn't say when the remaining results would be available. He spoke to the presidential campaigns on a conference call. Price said the Iowa Democratic Party is collecting paper records from more than 1,600 caucus sites to make sure it has all of the documented information in place. In the absence of official results, Bernie Sanders' campaign released internal tallies it compiled and covering nearly 40% of precincts. Those results showed Sanders on top, followed by Pete Buttigieg, then Elizabeth Warren, then Joe Biden.
When those results are announced, I have a good feeling we're going to be doing very, very well here in Iowa. And the message that Iowa has sent to the nation, it's a message shared by the American people, is that we want a government that represents all of us, not just wealthy campaign contributors and the 1%.
Speaking in New Hampshire today, Elizabeth Warren said she believes the results would show her closely tied with Sanders and Buttigieg. She urged her supporters not to be discouraged by the technical glitch in Iowa and events in Washington.
We had a bumpy start to the democratic process yesterday in Iowa. Tonight, Donald Trump gives State of the Union. And tomorrow, it appears that Republicans will continue to lock arms to protect an out-of-control president. Yes.
President Trump delivers his State of the Union address tonight while a handful of Democratic and Republican senators weigh whether to break party ranks during tomorrow's vote on the charges of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Between now and then, senators are taking turns making speeches laying out their positions. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said House Democrats are the ones guilty of abuse of power, not the president.
Washington Democrats think President Donald Trump committed a high crime or misdemeanor the moment he defeated Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. That is the original sin of this presidency, that he won and they lost.
But even some Republican senators who will not vote to convict Trump, like Lisa Murkowski and Lamar Alexander, have said the president's actions were wrong. Undecided Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia lamented the Senate wasn't considering a censure vote instead.
Censure would allow this body to unite across party lines and as an equal branch of government to formally denounce the president's actions and hold him accountable. His behavior cannot go unchecked by the Senate, and censure would allow a bipartisan statement condemning his unacceptable behavior in the strongest terms.
Democratic Senator Joe Manchin. The coronavirus is now reported to have infected more than 20,600 people globally, almost all of them in China. That country has reported 425 deaths. There's concern about the ability of countries with poor health systems to respond to the infectious disease. World Health Organization officials said no confirmed cases of the virus have been reported in Africa, but one health official said the risk is very, very high. Several African nations have reported suspected cases. Some are waiting for test results. Oklahoma officials are proposing a test excavation at a Tulsa cemetery in their search for a mass grave of African-American victims of a 1921 massacre. Carrie Stackelbeck with the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey said the proposal is to investigate a 25 by 30-foot pit that may hold the remains of victims.
What the geophysical data do not tell us is whether there are people in there, how many people would be in there, if they're buried in coffins. That's also why we're asking for patience. I know that this is not probably what people would rather be doing and talking about at this point, but we do firmly believe that it helps those next steps to know that we're in the right place first.
Over a 2-day period on May 31st and June 1st of 1921, white residents of Tulsa attacked and destroyed dozens of blocks of what was at that point the wealthiest black community in the United States, known as the Black Wall Street. Estimates of the dead ranged up to 300. Businesses were also destroyed. 10,000 people were left homeless. The massacre was touched off by a rumor that a 19-year-old black man who shined shoes had assaulted a 17-year-old white teenage girl. I'm Eileen Alfanderi for Pacifica Radio.
Good day and welcome to Letters in Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. The Senate continues to hear speeches from senators on their thoughts about the impeachment trial of President Donald Trump. Tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern, the Senate is scheduled to hold a final vote as to whether to convict or acquit the president, which most people believe will end in acquittal. The trial may be winding down, but the effects and precedents created by this entire process probably has just begun. Now, it's impossible to know exactly what those will be. Future historians will likely see things a bit differently than we do now. In fact, future historians probably will even be fiercely debating between each other what our times even mean. But allow me to lay out a possible spectrum on how things can go. And this isn't the ultimate spectrum. I'm going to leave some potential things out, including probably what Donald Trump supporters would consider to be on part of the spectrum. They would probably point to an out-of-control House of Representatives that's gone rabid over trying to take out Donald Trump. But I'm leaving that part out in the spectrum for a different set of potential outcomes in the spectrum. So, on one hand, the precedents that are being made now could be such things, and these are sort of the negative side, the strengthening of the so-called imperial presidency, eroding congressional role in oversight and investigation, blurring the lines of what's even considered abuse of power, and perhaps even most importantly, the further questioning the legitimacy of our own elections. Now, on the other hand, and this may be pie in the sky, but there is precedent for it, if Democrats had a great November election, won the White House, maintained control of the House of Representatives, and even won a supermajority in the Senate. It wasn't that long ago that the Democrats had a supermajority in the Senate just after the 2008 election. That would open up new kind of possibilities that, at least at this moment, may not seem possible. We could have congressional investigations into what occurred over the 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency, investigate such things as family separation at the border, the detainment of immigrant children. We could have such things as investigations into the blurring of the line between business and the White House, all kinds of things. And then perhaps that would, if you have control of Congress and the White House, and perhaps there would even be pressure for this, could lead to a number of reforms to address some of these things that we've seen, not just during the Trump presidency, but again, this drift towards what we would consider an imperial presidency. Now, that's a very rosy outlook, may not necessarily happen that way. And even if they tried to do it, even if all those things happened, doesn't mean that it would be successful. Because we do have, I would argue, a precedent for this. And it is the years following, or even leading right up to, the resignation of President Richard Nixon in 1974. There was a whole host of reforms that occurred between this period of time, including before he resigned, the War Powers Act of 1973, which Congress overrid the president with enough votes to override a veto. There was the FISA Act in 1978 that required, even though it be secretive, and a lot of people have problems with it, but the FISA courts, in which finally, even though it's secret and people consider it a rubber stamp, nonetheless, before that, we didn't have any judicial review of surveillance of Americans. There was the 1974 Impoundment Control Act, in which said that the president must spend all the money towards particular programs that were appropriated by Congress. That's the act that Donald Trump violated, according to the Government Accountability Office. Then you have such things as the Freedom of Information Act. You have the Government in the Sunshine Act of 1976, the Inspector General Act of 1978, Ethics in Government Act 1978, the Presidential Records Act of 1978, and I can go on and on. So I wanted this morning to take a little time to talk about the legislative reforms after and even really during the Nixon presidency, in responding to the presidency of Richard Nixon. And joining me on the telephone for this conversation is our good friend Rick Perlstein. Rick Perlstein is a historian, journalist, and author of a number of books, including Nixonland and The Invisible Bridge. His upcoming book this summer is called Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 1980. We certainly look forward to that. Rick Perlstein, appreciate your time. Thank you for coming back, sir.
Hey, Mitch, I'm like cramming all this stuff, and I can tell from just when you're like running down the list that I had forgotten a couple.
I got more. You want me to keep going through the list? We got the Privacy Act of 1974, the Tax Reform Act. So, I'm sorry to force you to listen to my lengthy introduction there. And I'm not saying these things are...
I want you to filibuster, man, because I'm like, still trying to figure a lot of this stuff out.
Well, what do you think about that, though? Just about that spectrum. You and I did have a good conversation previously about potential precedents that are going to be set during this entire impeachment process.
Right. I mean, the top line about what was going on is, it's basically built into our constitutional structure that there's always going to be a war of position between the branches of government for power. And yes, there was this very strong sense that was, formulated in a way that, every Washington person was paying attention to in the early 1970s, that as put it in a best-selling book. It really kind of broke through. We had an imperial presidency, that the presidency had grown way too powerful. And Congress, which was overwhelmingly Democratic, pushed back in all kinds of creative ways and responded to the traumas of Vietnam and Watergate, and also the Church and Pike committees, much too often forgotten when we discuss these things, that were about the abuses of the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA. People totally forget about that, that it was time for Congress to reassert itself. And like you say, this went on all over the place in all kinds of... the Impoundment Act is really interesting. I really feel like I could spend like a week just like reading up on this and kind of communicating it, because it's so important. It almost is like, in a lot of ways, the power to declare war, and that the Constitution is very explicit that, it's Congress that decides how to appropriate money, and the president, is the head of the executive branch, carrying out the laws, spends the money, sets up the agencies, is in charge of the agency. But it's very interesting. It's one of those things in the Constitution that is just kind of too kind of clunky to be practical when you look at it. Like, what if Congress... Right, so one of the first impoundments, was by Thomas Jefferson, and it was for kind of like a military operation or something like that. Again, I was cramming. That was over by the time it was time to spend the money that Congress had appropriated. So the president's like, well, of course I can't spend this money. So a lot of the way every president has impounded money has been innocent. The presidency, this is what the unitary executive folks are always saying, has this kind of quickness of action that these, old men sitting in this chamber can't possibly, with this cumbersome process of committees and amendments and votes and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a certain kind of practicality to it. So people would impound money that turned out to be too much that was required for the task, and it would be returned to the Treasury. Now, where this gets very interesting is with old man Nixon, who decides that he's going to impound money for simply ideological reasons. He impounds money intended for environmental cleanup, which is very interesting because we always hear this kind of cliche, Nixon was so much conservatives and Republicans now, and he was for the environment and everything. Well, not really. It's a little more complicated than that. So he impounded money intended for an environmental cleanup, and Congress went berserk. They said, you're taking our power. And the guy who was, the point of the spear for this was Sam Ervin, who was this kind of stickler for the black letter of the Constitution. And so, here I am kind of Googling around and trying to figure out this stuff. And there was this great New York Times article that, folks can Google because everything in the New York Times is now pretty much available on their website. If you Google the Senate is determined to recover some of its powers, and Sam Ervin, you can see that what basically explained what Ervin was up to in May of 1973 in trying to get an Impoundment Act passed. When this power was clarified, and there was this very interesting colloquy between himself and this guy from the Justice Department who he tied in knots, basically trying to point to a place in the Constitution where this is allowed. And there is no place, right? It is this kind of shadow constitutional thing. Just like there's no place in the Constitution where it says the Congress can decide to invade a country and then go back to Congress later and get their approval. So it's really kind of, like I said, this war of position. And Congress was extremely aggressive about it in the mid-1970s. A lot of it was because the scales fell from people's eyes. People trusted the executive branch. People trusted the president. Obviously, you couldn't do that after Nixon. You couldn't do that after the Church Committee. One of the things that came out in the Church Committee investigations was that the National Security Agency had something called Operation Shamrock, which, had you heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was basically that a staffer from the NSA would show up at Western Union, the telegram company, every day and copy down every telegram that went between a foreign country and the United States every single day, thousands and thousands and thousands. And when a representative at the counsel for the NSA was asked by a congressional investigator, is this legal? He kind of was like, well, I don't know, but and it was one of these kind of very dramatic moments in which people are like, holy cow, there's no guardrails here, and Congress got to work, and it took a while. It's a very sensitive matter, right? It's very, there's lots of undue deference towards the president when it comes to security. But, within 3 years, they do have this FISA court, which, for all its flaws, like you say, is at least something where there used to be nothing. There was no consideration of legality whatsoever.
And I think you bring up a good point when you talk about the Frank Church Committee investigations, the Pike investigations, that, Nixon is very much tied into all this, but it also predates Nixon too, doesn't it? It just sort of comes into focus with Nixon. Right. I would argue similarly like it is today with Trump.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I've wanted to write a book called Everything You Wanted to Know About the American Government But Were Afraid to Ask Donald Trump. And the way that kind of, when Trump does so many things, kind of wrong, it explains to us what's kind of supposed to happen. But yeah, so a good example is the fact that Army intelligence under Lyndon Johnson started this program that was doing, all kinds of awful things, spying on anti-war activists, infiltrating groups. And when Sam Ervin went to the White House and the Nixon administration and said, let's shut down this terrible program and was shut out, he was like, wow, I should look into this. And, it turns out that it was going on like a lot of things under Nixon. It was still going on, turned up to 11, right? So, Trump does all this stuff that has always been going on, but much worse. And so that was kind of what kind of pricked up his eyebrows, his famous, thick, tangle eyebrows. And that really kind of got him on the trail that really kind of led him to becoming the leader of investigating Watergate. But this stuff was, going on under Lyndon Johnson, ever since 1966.
Yeah. And keep in mind, we're talking once you get to the Frank Church Committee hearings and these investigations and such things as COINTELPRO, government overthrows in Guatemala. Right. I mean, this is when the CIA is turning about almost 30 years of age, 30 years of time that we've actually had the CIA. And it's like, oh, look what this agency's been doing. For 3 decades.
They were. Frank Church called them a rogue elephant. Like, holy cow, we didn't even realize this. And the FBI, the Church Committee was when it came out that J. Edgar Hoover had, personally written this fake letter to Martin Luther King trying to get him to commit suicide. I mean, that was right out there. It came out that, John F. Kennedy was, having affairs in the White House. And we talk about Church. I don't want to forget Otis Pike. He was the member of Congress from New York who ran the House investigation, which was even more aggressive. So aggressive, in fact, that the CIA created this propaganda operation that ended up suppressing his reports. Who's that? The guy from NPR who passed away, that great journalist. He secretly got a copy of it and passed it to the Village Voice, and it was published secretly. It was published illegally or legally or whatever. It was published in the Village Voice, the Pike Report. So this was very dramatic cloak and dagger stuff. And if we're looking for examples for today, yes, you had journalists willing to go to jail. You had Democrats willing to openly defy the president. You had journalists, you had members of Congress, senators and congressmen using any method by hook or by crook, getting malfeasance into the public record. I mean, don't forget Senator Mike Gravel deciding that if the Pentagon Papers were part of the congressional record, that they couldn't be suppressed. And he had this tiny little committee that was in charge of, basically the air conditioning in the Capitol, and he just basically held a hearing and just started reading it aloud.
To put it in the record.
Crying. And then it was in the record, and then it was public. Yeah. So, kind of where's our senator? It's like we know, for example, that, Lev Parnas is, his lawyer's written a letter saying, look, we have the receipts. We have the evidence that not only were officials in the Trump administration involved in this scheme to pressure Ukraine, that Lindsey Graham was part of the scheme. One of the jurors who was passing on his judgment about this, as we literally was involved. That Pat Cipollone, one of the lawyers, Trump's defense lawyers, was involved. So where are the people who are doing what Mike Gravel has done and holding the hearings to get this out into the public record?
Yeah, that's right. Because Mike Gravel at the time was a senator. He had immunity if he got these records, if he got the Pentagon Papers and then brought them to the committee and made them as part of the record.
They could completely wipe, the Senate. The Senate, what do you call it when you get someone off? The cover-up, the Republican Senate cover-up off the front pages by getting this into the public record. They could do it if they had the will.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are speaking to Rick Perlstein, historian, journalist, and author of a number of books, including Nixonland and The Invisible Bridge. His latest book, to be out later in the year, is called Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 1980. Rick Perlstein, I want to go back to the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, just because it is so sexy now. And it's interesting that you point out that it was just really one program, environmental cleanup, that Nixon was withholding funds for?
Oh, he did it for all kinds of...
Okay.
But that was kind of what first kind of pricked up people's eyebrows. Like I said, I need to do a lot more research on this because it's almost forgotten.
Yeah.
But what we talked about last time when we spoke was how this is really not being kind of reported it in an adequate way, and they're making it seem like Trump was just violating this, kind of one obscure statute, but really the statute was intended to basically clarify a basic constitutional principle, that the president doesn't decide what programs he likes or doesn't like. Maybe there's a little flexibility, to practicality. If, there's a widget that the government needs to buy that they can get on sale for $40. Maybe they don't have to pay $400 for it. Maybe the executive branch should have some flexibility for that. Maybe that's a practicality that you can't really avoid. But, you can't say, no, I'm not going to, that I'm going to fund the Contras, even though Congress specifically says I can't, or I'm not going to fund security aid for Ukraine, even though Congress, including Republicans, specifically says I must. That is as black, plain, flashing red lights of a violation of the Constitution as you can possibly imagine.
Yeah, and you mentioned the book, the popular book, best-selling book that was published around this time, The Imperial Presidency, as written by historian Arthur Schlesinger. And he makes his argument in there that historically and constitutionally, the power of Congress rests really on three separate legs, one being the power to declare war, which basically Congress hasn't used since World War II. The second one is of appropriations, which you're talking about right now, hence the importance of it. The third one is oversight and investigation, another major power that right now is in question with, as to whether or not Donald Trump would actually get away and not have to pay.
One of the House managers, just with a chip, I don't remember, said, look, this is what the three things Congress is supposed to do, and he just checked them off. And he's like, all of them are being crushed, all of them being destroyed. And again, like we said last time, this is part of a process that's moving us much closer to a dictatorship than a republic.
Yeah, and then, just going back to the power of appropriation and the Impoundment Control Act 1974, again, the attention is being put right now on withholding the military aid to Ukraine. But I could think just off the top of my head other instances when the president has used the power of the purse outside of what Congress wanted, including building the wall, the southern wall.
Exactly.
And also providing money to Saudi Arabia in its war in Yemen. Those would be just two other examples.
That's right. Bernie Sanders to end that funding. And what's possible? What if Congress appropriates money to investigate the 2020 election?
Yeah.
The possibilities are endless, right? And it's a slippery slope that leads to, Congress taking on all the powers of the House of Lords in Great Britain.
So, Rick Perlstein, as we're talking about these legislative reforms that would come after, and even actually just before the resignation of Richard Nixon in 1974, could we argue, and I've heard it argued, that the next two presidencies we have, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, would be what we might consider the opposite of the imperial presidency, maybe even weak presidencies? Do you think that's fair?
That's a tricky one. Weaker, possibly, but don't forget Gerald Ford's signature act was pardoning Richard Nixon, basically saying no crime he might have committed, might not even know about it yet, can possibly be prosecuted, which, really kind of is the imperial presidency to its uttermost. And as I tweeted last week, that was really what taught the Republicans that they could get away with anything. So that's problematic, and also certainly not anything illegal, but Gerald Ford set the record for presidential vetoes, right? So he had this overwhelming Democratic Congress, and every time something passed without a veto-proof majority, he would just veto it. Fortunately for posterity, a lot of stuff was passed with veto-proof majorities, really amazing stuff, like a very radical Clean Air Acts that forced car manufacturers to have fuel efficiency standards and things like that. As far as Jimmy Carter, it is true that he did some pretty amazing stuff, giving up the Panama Canal. He had this kind of democratic purity, contempt for power, which was not great for the fortunes of the Democratic Party. One of my favorite lines in his diary, favorite in the sense of, wow, my eyes are falling out of my head, is he says, well, Congress has passed this law creating all these new federal judges, and if I appoint all these judges, I'll have appointed half the federal judiciary, and I don't really want this, right? So he almost had this kind of contempt for placing his kind of stamp on the rest of the government. But on the other hand, he did, sign a finding allowing the CIA to secretly train the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which had basically awful effects that led to the rise of the Taliban. And you can kind of see him. There's something about being in the presidency that makes it very hard to refuse power when you have the possibility of using it. John Connally, when the Democrats passed a law allowing the president to impose wage and price controls, which Richard Nixon had always said was anathema, advised him, he was the Treasury Secretary, of course you can assign this. You never pass up the opportunity to take power that you might someday want to use. It's like having a shotgun from behind the door. And lo and behold, he did pass wage and price controls for completely cynical political reasons, and that expanded the power of the executive branch even more. So, there were a lot of shotguns behind the door that Jimmy Carter was loath to give up, even though he, might have gone into office thinking he wanted to. One was Congress, a senator who was voted out of office from Iowa named Dick Clark, passed banning aid to the rebels in Angola. Basically anti-communist rebels in Angola, because he didn't want another Vietnam, and Jimmy Carter tried to get around that. So, it's complicated stuff. But yes, for the most part, he was no Nixon.
Except for all that other stuff you just laid out, all the shotguns behind the door,
stuff, right?
The peanut farmer and his shotgun. Rick Perlstein, as we move to wrap up here, then just give me a preview then of this upcoming book, Reaganland, and maybe how
it's all in there, man.
I know, and maybe how Reagan fits into this idea of the expanding imperial presidency.
Yeah, I mean, it's in The Invisible Bridge, my previous book, too. But, Reagan thought measures were ridiculous. He just called it some innocent, what do you call it, keyhole peeping, and he always, during these years from 1976 to 1980, when he was, kind of plotting his ascension to the White House, would always side with the executive branch in all these questions. And most remarkably, when the David Frost interviews were on TV, that was in 1970, and famously Richard Nixon says, if the president does it, it's not illegal. Ronald Reagan was asked at a press conference what he thought about that, and he said, well, of course, if the president does it, it's not illegal. The president has to have the power to declare things legal after he does them, because or else. And then he told this crazy story about this one time terrorists supposedly wanted to kidnap his wife, and he went into Reagan woo-woo land. But he of course, and I also discovered that he was very interested in kind of paramilitary activities going on in Central America even before he was president, and had this idea that maybe the president should be. So it was all kind of. It was all there in embryo before he got to the White House. No big surprises, except for possibly a surprise that he ended up being the guy who tried to eliminate nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
So, history is full of ironies.
Absolutely. Rick Perlstein, historian, journalist, author of a number of books, including Nixonland and The Invisible Bridge. His forthcoming book that will be out this summer is called Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 1980, and we're very much looking forward to that. Rick Perlstein, thank you, sir, for spending so much time with us and talking about these issues today.
Thanks, Mitch. My pleasure.
And you're listening to Letters in Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. When we come back, we're going to Iowa to find out the very latest concerning the caucus there. We still don't have results, and also sort of get some context and talk about the history of what the Iowa caucus is and why they even have it. Stay tuned. And you're listening to Letters in Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich at the studios of KPFA in Berkeley. Just want to let listeners know that we will be going back tomorrow, just in the hours leading up to the final vote concerning the impeachment trial of President Donald Trump. And so starting at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, we will resume our coverage of the impeachment trial, which should more than likely come to an end tomorrow. But right now, we want to dive into what's happening in Iowa and the Iowa caucus. We still don't have results. It is now being reported that the Iowa Democratic Party told the 2020 presidential campaigns that it plans to release a portion, at least a portion, of the caucus results at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, which would be 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. In other words, about 3.5 hours from now. Well, let's go to Iowa. Joining us via Skype is David Redlawsk. David Redlawsk is the James R. Souls Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. He is the author of several books, including Why Iowa, How Caucuses and Sequential Elections Improve the Presidential Nominating Process. And his new book, to be out this spring, is called A Citizen's Guide to the Political Psychology of Voting. David Redlawsk, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. We want to make sure we got a good sound of you. We hear a lot of ruffling around. So I know you're in Iowa, probably trying to check out all this stuff. So
I don't know what it is, actually. I'm not quite sure what the sound is on my microphone.
Well, it sounds like it might be rubbing against something, maybe a jacket or a scarf. Or
Let's try. Let's see if that's any better.
That sounds much better. That sounds much better.
All right, good.
All right. So I mean, this is your thing. You've written books about the Iowa caucus. You're in Iowa. I imagine following the caucus now. What's happening? What's your take about all this?
Well, yes, I've actually been in Iowa since August, following all the campaigns around and doing research on the caucus process and voters. Well, I mean, I'm surprised, I suppose. While there have been challenges in past caucuses, both Republican and Democrat, in terms of getting numbers out fast, this is a lot different than it's been even then. The idea that we don't have any numbers yet and won't till at least 5 p.m. Eastern today, just suggests that things did not go particularly well in the reporting process. I will say that at least I was at a precinct myself at a caucus, and it went fine on the ground. The reports that I've seen show, a few issues here and there, some confusion among the volunteers, but for the most part, the problem seems to be much more about getting the results from nearly 1,700 precincts back to the Iowa Democratic Party.
Getting all of those in one spot where they could be tallied, basically, is the issue.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is done across the state, as I mentioned, in all those precincts, and it's run by volunteers. These are not paid folks. These are not elections officials. These are volunteers who are trained, but nonetheless, in the pressure of a caucus with maybe hundreds of people in the room, a few errors creep in here and there. But I really don't think that's where the core problem is.
Now, there's several things that are different than from the previous caucus. For one, you just have a number of candidates that potentially could be viable in the caucus, which is quite different than 4 years ago when you had just Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, maybe Martin O'Malley for a moment. And then also the implementation of a new digital system. And the reports that I keep hearing is that what's at the heart of the problem is an app. What do you understand the changes that they're using this year that may be leading to this problem?
Yeah, it's there are a couple things going on. I think the app side of it is one. By all reports, the precinct chairs did not get their hands on the app until recently and had problems with it almost from day one. But really all the app was supposed to do is provide a way to do some calculations, which can readily be done by hand and normally are, and to report the results back to the party headquarters. The backup was supposed to be, if it doesn't work on the app, just give us a call. And that's where people were really expressing frustration, talking about being on hold for an hour or 2 hours, the phone not being answered. It sounds to me like the party essentially assumed the app would be okay and may not have set up the phone lines to allow, again, 1,600 phone calls to come in all at roughly the same time. The changes, I'll quickly note, have to do with what is being reported. Back in the day, as in 4 years ago, the only thing that the Iowa Democrats ever reported was what they call the delegate equivalents. This is all about electing delegates to the national convention. And so Democrats never reported the details of turnout, but simply reported, Bernie Sanders won this many delegates, Hillary Clinton won this many delegates. This time around, the Democratic National Committee promulgated new rules that forced Iowa to also report the number of voters for each candidate in the first ballot, and also the number of voters for the candidate in what we call the realignment. That is, after candidates who don't reach 15% are dropped from consideration. It's adding those two reporting requirements in addition to the delegate count that I think is the crux of the issue.
Well, and these are changes that were advocated for by Sanders' campaign. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I always like to point out that parties in general fight the last battle when they're setting up the rules for the next one. So the Democratic rules really responded to complaints from Sanders that in Iowa in particular, well, he lost to Clinton barely on delegates. They believed they had more people on the ground. The problem with that argument, even then, was that those weren't the rules of the game. The rules of the game were delegates, not people on the ground. But instead, instead of standing with that, the DNC said, well, sure, okay, transparency requires that we change everything we've ever done, and we'll do that for the next election.
I mean, there's an argument for that, right? I mean, there's no reason why we shouldn't know these things, I would imagine.
Well, yeah, I mean, it sounds perfectly reasonable. The challenge is that the caucuses were not invented for the purposes of presidential nominations. They were invented well over 150 years ago for the purposes of party building. And so the original intention of the caucus is to bring members of the party in a neighborhood together to elect local party leadership, the precinct people, to the central committee, to the county committee, to discuss potential platform planks that would go forward to the county and eventually the state, and to elect people to the county party convention. Both parties do this. Both parties still do this. For the Democrats, because it's a public meeting of party members, everything in a public meeting for the Democrats is public. That is no secret ballots. For the Republicans, they do a secret ballot for president. They just added it on to the process, and it's pretty simple. Drop a piece of paper in a box. Chair opens the box and counts all the pieces of paper. But the Democrats have a proportional system. It requires candidates to get at least 15% to get any delegates. And they invented this idea of a second round so that people whose candidates did not reach 15% would have the opportunity to still be heard by expressing their second choice. The reason it's complicated to count all that partly is it literally is people milling around in a room, but secondly, sometimes people go home in between, and it can create anomalies in how the count is done and anomalies in how the calculations are done. The big picture here is you're reducing, 150,000, 200,000 people to basically 1,400 state delegate equivalents. If you're just doing the delegates, a couple of people here and there off on the count actually has no real impact. But if you're actually reporting the count, then you've got a different story and you need a different system.
Now, Iowa is getting a real beating in national media right now, and the caucus system in particular. And I've been hearing calls on the cable networks that it's time to get rid of this caucus system. So we thought we'd go out on a limb and perhaps bring you on, who I think is supportive of the caucuses. At least I don't want to put words in your mouth, but your previous book is Why Iowa, How Caucuses and Sequential Elections Improve the Presidential Nominating process. Do you have any concern, and are concerns, do you think, legitimate about what the outcome of the results we're going to get, hopefully, later today? Should they be in question at all now after all this?
So I think that I don't see any reason for concern that the results that will be reported are not accurate. There are paper backups to everything, and everything's been done in public. Everyone in the precinct heard the announcements of the vote counts and the delegates. That part I'm not concerned about. But the bigger picture issue that has built over the last couple cycles is the extent to which Iowa is a good place to even start this process. For the Democrats in particular, the argument that absolutely has legitimacy is that Iowa is not especially descriptively representative of the Democratic Party. It's a very white state. It is more urban than people think, but even the urban areas aren't really that large. And, to some degree, it's a good question whether that's where the Democratic Party should start these days. My take on this, on that part of the question, is that you cannot debate the question of Iowa being descriptively representative. It is not.
Yeah.
But Iowa Democrats are ideologically quite representative of the National Democratic Party, including the basic split in the party. Iowa Democrats are split roughly 50-50 between the liberal progressive wing and the center left wing. And so is the National Party. So in some sense, Iowa Democrats do represent the party that way. They represent the party on the issues they're concerned about. And so I'm less concerned about that piece. The other part I will point out in terms of thinking about this process generally is that Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, taken as a group, the first four states before we really get into it, are in fact nicely representative of the Democratic Party writ large. And so in some sense, seeing these four states up front continues to make some sense. And that's because one of the things Iowa does, New Hampshire certainly does as well, is force candidates to be out on the ground, talking to voters, listening to them. And I watched over the 6 months, candidates become more responsive, become better, make adjustments to their platforms because of the things they heard very directly from the hundreds and thousands of questions they got asked by voters.
David Redlawsk is our guest. David Redlawsk is the James R. Souls Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware, author of such books as Why Iowa, How Caucuses and Sequential Elections Improve the Presidential Nominating Process. His forthcoming book is called A Citizen's Guide to the Political Psychology of Voting. David Redlawsk, maybe we can get a little preview of the Citizen's Guide to Political Psychology of Voting, and asking what the effects, though, of the delay in the results may have in the election. One thing, again, that I hear, especially from the cable networks, is that this has a dramatic effect because you have a situation where candidates who won well are not going to have the same kind of momentum they would ever otherwise had because people aren't talking about them having great results. And same thing for people who underperform or don't perform well. They're not, perhaps taking the hit that maybe they should out of this process. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you just summed it up exactly right. The one of the roles Iowa has always played, and one of the reasons that in our book we see value in this process, is that Iowa provided a kind of information to voters later in the process. That is, as the candidates campaigned, as they learned, as the voters learned, voters in this sequential system in other states would gain something from what Iowa was doing and from what was forced into this process because of the need for candidates to be here. Voting, choosing a candidate ought to be about information, and the work I do is in that context, the role information plays in voter decision making. And Iowa historically has been a good source, not the only one, but a good source of information. The problem, of course, is that only works if there's an actual outcome. And this time around, there will be, but by the time we get it, we're into the State of the Union address and the coverage of that, the impeachment vote
tomorrow,
the acquittal vote tomorrow, and then the New Hampshire primary itself next Tuesday. So candidates who did not do as well in Iowa as expected, and I'm anticipating Joe Biden is going to be one of those, would normally have been significantly hurt by that. But I think everyone's going to essentially forget Iowa. It's not going to play that informational role this time around.
That's interesting. And then watching the candidates last night was also interesting in how they responded to it. And perhaps maybe we take, we want to be careful of reading too much into it. But Amy Klobuchar, I thought, really took the opportunity of, let me go first. Since, we don't have to come up and say things went bad or well or whatever. We could just act like they went well. And then you had, at the very same time, and I thought this was telling, Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren at the very same time give their speeches. And I was watching CNN, and CNN went with Joe Biden's speech over Elizabeth Warren's speech. And then we get Pete Buttigieg's speech, in which it just was like a 45-minute victory speech. I mean, really interesting how these candidates responded. What stood out to you?
Yeah, no, it was really interesting. I think what stood out firstly was Buttigieg essentially declaring victory, which is at some level risky because he may not have actually won by the measures on the ground, but he had been dropping back in the polls. He had not been doing as well in the most recent polls that had been putting either Sanders or Biden up. So even if maybe he came in second, that certainly can be spun as doing much better than expected. And in that context, that's a victory. But I was surprised at how blatantly he made the claim, given the lack of knowledge. The Biden situation, again, understand the campaigns have some sense of what went on the ground because they had precinct captains in as many precincts as they could.
Do they know who won?
Reporting directly to the campaigns. I don't know that they know who won because they rely on their captains to report to the campaigns. But for example, the Sanders campaign released what their captains told them, but it's only 40% of the precincts. And it looks really good for Sanders. But if you're a Sanders precinct captain and it doesn't go well in your precinct, you're probably just going home and not bothering to report to the campaign. So it's a biased sample. But the campaigns have some sense of what the picture looks like, but nobody has the full picture.
How was turnout last night?
Well, again, we don't actually know, but we will know. But by all accounts, it did not end up stunning as many of us, including me, thought it would be. All through this cycle, the events I've gone to, Democrats have seemed very engaged, involved. The crowds were large, even for minor candidates. My sense was people were going to show up. The precinct I went to in Des Moines, the chair told me that in 2016 there were about 350 people there. There were about 380 people there last night. So essentially 2016 turnout, not 2008 turnout. Here's what the difference is. In 2008, nearly 240,000 Democrats, about 40% of them, turned out. But in 2016, it was about 171,000 Democrats, significantly less. My guess is that's about where we are this time around.
And again, we don't have the final number, so we're speculating a little bit, but still interesting and perhaps troubling for Democrats, in which we've mostly seen ever since the 2016 election, every election since, we've seen sort of a great deal of enthusiasm for elections you normally don't even see enthusiasm for midterm elections, for special elections. But I guess, you were surprised. I guess I was surprised, too, if this turnout is on par with the 2016 caucus.
Yeah, and in Iowa as well, in 2018, they flipped two congressional districts, picked up seats in the Iowa House. Turnout was up for an off-year election. But I would also be careful of reading too much into this. And a caucus is more challenging than a primary. You've got to go to a certain place at a certain time and spend an hour or two at least there, not like voting in a primary. There are no early votes. There's no way to do it except to show up. So the lots of things can get in the way of the showing up. I wouldn't read too much into this. I'd be a lot more concerned if, let's say, the next several primaries going forward show decline in interest.
Where does the tradition of caucuses come from? I mean, is this something you'd find in ancient democratic Greece or Athens or and where does this come from?
In some sense, it's a lot like the old New England town meetings, right, where people are getting together and talking politics. But it really comes from probably the early to mid 19th century. The idea of the caucus was a group of people of like political persuasion, political party, getting together to work on party business. We had that before we had national conventions, for example, in terms of the presidential nominations. This is going 150 years plus back. But Iowa started, as did most Midwestern states, their political party organizations always used caucuses in Iowa from before it was a state to build the party organization from the grassroots and to run the party. So in a sense, it's an old style political activity that actually engages people in a way that we usually don't. The problem for the modern world is we've grafted this presidential nomination on top of it in a world that expects immediate information, but this system is an old-fashioned system that isn't designed for immediate information. But I'll remind people, we went weeks after the 2018 election with counting ballots in congressional districts in California, for example, where you're voting the normal way, except they now have a lot of mail-in ballots that don't get counted until a week or so after the election.
That's right.
It's this demand for the immediacy, that the media and the public wants. We have to know now, that is creating the real challenge.
David Redlawsk, we're down to our final minute, but again, we have this issue right now, and it's certainly a debacle. In 2012, the results were in the Republican caucus for Mitt Romney. It was found out weeks later that Rick Santorum actually won. Rick Santorum says his candidacy was basically over by that point because of the results from Iowa. Yeah. Do you think this puts the future of the Iowa caucus in jeopardy?
It certainly adds to the jeopardy it was already in on the Democratic side, because of this question of descriptive representation that we talked about. Democrats have been pushing to eliminate caucuses anyway. This gives additional ammunition. My sense is this: if a Democrat wins the presidency this fall, the caucuses are safe for 2024 because presumably that president would run for re-election, would not be opposed. The Democratic caucus wouldn't matter. The Republicans like the caucus. They're defending the caucus. The Iowa Republican Party is defending the Iowa Democratic Party. It's the one thing they still agree on. The Republicans would hold their competitive caucus and probably keep Iowa first, delaying us to 2028 before we really know what happens on the Democratic side.
All right. So in about 2 hours from now, or maybe 3 hours from now. 3 hours from now. What am I talking about? This is what happens to me when I do math on air. About 3 hours from now, we can expect to start to get some of the results from the Iowa caucus. I don't know. Maybe we'll have the final results during the State of the Union address.
It seems possible at this point.
David Redlawsk, thank you. I enjoyed that.
Thanks. Enjoyed it very much.
And David Redlawsk is the James R. Soules Professor of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware, author of the book, Why Iowa, How Caucuses and Sequential Elections Improve the Presidential Nominating Process. His forthcoming book is called A Citizen's Guide to the Political Psychology of Voting. And that does it for Letters and Politics. The show is produced by Deanna Martinez. Rod Akil is our engineer. If you'd like to hear archives of this program, you can do so online by going to kpfa.org. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I thank you for listening.
Supposedly, Facebook, yes, that gargantuan entity, was built in 1 week by Mark Zuckerberg during his second year in college. Today, with nearly 3 billion users, Facebook is a tremendous global force and an enormous mixed bag. Stephen Levy, editor-at-large of Wired and author of Hackers and In the Plex, has now written the full deep saga, Facebook, The Inside Story. Levy will appear with Brian Edwards Stiekert at a KPFA benefit on Friday evening, March 6th, beginning at 7:30 at First Presbyterian Church, 2407 Dana Street in Berkeley. There's wheelchair access tickets available at East Bay Indie Bookshops or online at brownpapertickets.com. Get yours soon, March 6th. Stephen Levy.
You're listening to 94.1 KPFA, 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, 97.5 K248BR in Santa Cruz, and online worldwide at kpfa.org.